peeps, welcome to another video. Today it's part 2 of the new look 6080 sew along. So today we're going to be working on the collar and the facing for the lining. So let's get started. Okay, so I have my instructions, I have all my pieces cut out, I have my entertainment, Ready Player One. Let's get started. Okay, so usually the first instruction is to interface all of the pieces that you need to interface, but it's not the case in this pattern, and because they don't tell me to do it first, I want to, so I'm going to go and interface all of my pieces that need interfacing. Now the only deviation I am going to make on this is that my upper collar and under collar, I didn't have enough fabric to cut them out in the fold, so I've had to cut them out with a seam allowance. So I'm going to seam these, press the seam allowance open and then interface it. So I'm going to do that bit first and then interface everything else. Okay, so I've interfaced the collar things, and that means that I've taken the pattern pieces off and they're very similar. So what I'm going to do is skip ahead to step number 4, apply interfacing to upper and under collar sections. With right sides together, pin upper collar to under collar, matching centre backs, double notches and large dots. Stitch easing upper collar to fit under collar, leaving single notched edge open, layer the seams. So basically we're stitching the large outer edge, matching up all of our notches and leaving this single notched edge open. Okay, so the under collar is smaller than the upper collar, so I've marked my under collar with this pin so that I know which one is which, but it should be obvious, but just in case. And I have matched up the large circles, matched up the centre back. That's really easy for me because obviously I have seams there. I've matched up the notches, and then I'm going to sew this at 5/8 of an inch from the large circle round to the other large circle. Okay, so I've sewn my under collar to my upper collar, and I've sewn with my under collar on the top because this one is the smaller one of the two, so I wanted to make sure that there is no puckering happening. I've also trimmed down the seam allowance in half, and I'm now going to layer the seam allowance, which means that I'm going to trim the under collar seam allowance in half again, and I think that is the right way round, because when you have it everything turned the right way out, what you want on top here is your larger seam allowance and then your smaller seam allowance underneath, so that you don't end up with a ridge on the shorter layered seam allowance on top. So you want to have your longer seam allowance on the side that is going to be visible. So I'm going to trim this in half, and then I'm going to press it open and understitch the seam allowance to the under collar, which is step number 5. So I have layered my under collar seam in half again. So the next thing I'm going to do is press this seam flat with all of the seam allowance towards the under collar so that I can understitch it. So I'm going to go do that now. Okay, so I'm understitching. This is the under collar, this is the upper collar. All of the seam allowance is pressed down to this edge, and I am understitching a couple of mil away from the actual ditch where the stitching line is. And when I'm sewing, I'm putting a little bit of tension on both sides and just making sure that the seam allowance stays towards the under collar. So I'm going to do that the entire way around, and then we're going to press it again. So you can see here our understitching. This is the under collar, and I've pressed this flat now. Don't stab yourself with a pin, that's a bad thing. And from the right side, this is what the pressed collar looks like. So because we've done all this work with the under collar being smaller than the upper collar, with the understitching and everything, you should have the over collar or the upper collar rolling to the underside, so you should be able to see about 1/8 of an inch of the upper collar once everything is pressed. So the next thing that it would like us to do, well, we've turned collar and press, which we've done, and machine based raw edges together. Now I am going to do that with this fabric because this fabric actually does have a slight stretch to it, so I'm going to make it behave itself as much as possible. So I'm going to machine baste these two raw edges together, and I'm going to do that at 1/4 of an inch because our seam allowance is 5/8 of an inch, so I want to make sure that that stitching line is well within the seam allowance so it won't be seen on the finished garment. Okay, the next thing I'm going to work on are the facings, because I have unpinned them from their pattern pieces, so whilst I still have them kind of together, I want to make sure that I'm going to get that all correct. So I am going to apply interfacing to front and back sections. I've done that. Stitch shoulder seams with facing sections. I'm going to do that. Edge finished unnotched edge, machine stitch 1/2 of an inch, 1.3 centimeters from back neck edge, clip back neck edge to stitching. Okay, so the first thing I've done is interface all of my facing sections, and don't forget that we've actually drafted one for the back as well. So I'm then going to stitch them together at the sides, at the shoulder seams, and also at the side seams, so we end up with one nice big continuous loop. And then I'm going to finish my interior edge with bias binding, so I'll show you that as we go. So the first step is to sew the back neck facing to the front facings at the shoulder seams, and these always make my head hurt a little bit because I need to remember which way up this needs to face and then these need to go together. So you want to make sure that your notches are matching up, which mine are, and then this is the blunt edge, which is the seam allowance, and that's fitting in with the curved edge of the back facing. And then there's also a blunt edge here, which is also the seam allowance, and that's fitting in with the side edge of the front facing. So I'm going to sew those together at 5/8 of an inch and press those seams open. Okay, so once we've sewn our shoulders together, you want to turn the work over so you've got the front facing pieces right sides up, and that way you can attach the back facing piece. So I have pinned it together at both sides, and once those seams are sewn at 5/8 of an inch, we're going to end up with a nice continuous facing piece, which we can then press the seams open and finish the inside raw edge. So I'm going to sew these seams here at 5/8 of an inch and then press all the seams open. Okay, so once you've sewn everything together and pressed your seams open, you should end up with something that looks like this. So this is the back neck facing, these are the front facing pieces, which are this is what it's going to look like when it's installed into the garment and being worn. So you've got the wrong sides of those up, and then this is the back facing piece. So what we need to do now is finish this interior edge, so this bit here. We're going to do that with bias binding, and we're going to sew that on, and I'm going to show you how, but I just wanted to make sure that we are doing the interior edge, so that nice long curvy bit inside. Okay, so you're looking at this from the side, so hopefully this will be clear. But I don't pin my bias binding down, I have the reel in my lap and I sort of spool off quite a large amount so that I have some excess to be working with, and I pin the first part to the work so that, because this bit is a little bit slippery and we want to make sure that this part behaves itself. So I have folded the raw edge of the bias binding back on itself by about 3/4 of an inch, and I've pinned that down, and I've got the raw edge of the binding against the raw edge of the interior of our facing, and it's the wrong side of the facing to the right side of the binding, so the bit of the binding where you can't see any of the raw edges. I still have my black thread in my machine because that's not going to be seen at the moment, so I don't need to switch over to purple just yet. I'm going to stitch in this crease here and keeping this raw edge of the binding up against the raw edge of the facing. So we're stitching about 1/4 of an inch away from the raw edge in this crease, securing the binding to the facing. I'm going to do that the whole way around, and when we get to this part again, because it's a big circle that we're doing, I'm going to overlap by about the same amount again and just sew that down and then trim off any excess. Backstitch at the start. That pin was literally in there to make sure that this all behaved itself, so I'm now going to sew in that crease with that raw edge against that raw edge. So I've overlapped by about the same again, backstitched, and now I'm going to trim off the excess. Okay, so the next thing we need to do is top stitch fold our binding around to the right sides and top stitch it down. And if you've watched any of my other videos, you know that I like to use my blind hem foot to do this because it has a guide on it. You can get edge stitching feet for your machines, but mine is about £38 and I have this one which came with my machine, so I'm going to use this for now. I'm going to put this on my machine, move my needle all the way over to the left, and then run that guide against the edge of the binding, which will give me a nice continuous top stitch and secure the binding in place. Okay, this is another one of those interesting camera angles. So what you want to do, and again I don't pin this, I press with my right hand, I press the fabric down, and with my left hand I kind of fold the binding over and kind of just maneuver the fabric around. I actually have the facing wrapped around the camera as well at the moment, so it's kind of a two-handed job. So push down with your right hand on the fabric, push down on your left with your left fingers on the binding. Make sure everything is nice and flat and keep that edge against that guide against the edge of the binding. And try and keep the facing out of the way of the camera. Once you've top stitched your bias binding down, you want to give it a good press, and then you should end up with something that looks like this. So the inside edge of your facing pieces are the ones that have the binding on them. So we can set this aside for now until we have finished sewing our lining together. We can now go back to step 1 of the instructions. If you have any questions at all, please let me know in the comments section down below and I will do my very best to answer them for you. I really hope you've enjoyed today's video. If you have, please give it a thumbs up. If you haven't yet, please subscribe and I'll see you again very soon. Bye!